In this unit we're going to pick up from where we left off at the end of Unit 1 and go on looking at the development of language teaching methodology. In Unit 1 we got up to the end of the 1970s where we saw that the big excitement in language teaching in the 70s had been the change in attitude to the language, what it was we were actually teaching, and the new emphasis on teaching language use, which led not only to the development of the notional functional syllabus, but also in changes in methodology, particularly in the introduction of practice activities such as information gaps, drama activities, role plays, and so on, which gave the students simulated practice in using the language in conditions which were close to those of spontaneous language use. However, as I said, the emphasis was still very, very much on the language itself. In the 1980s, that changed, and the emphasis shifted from an interest in the language and how the language worked to an interest in the learner. That had already been anticipated in the 70s with the development of the idea of ESP, English for Specific Purposes, the idea that you could analyse the communicative needs of a learner and then teach all and only the language that he or she needed to fulfil those needs. So, for example, with a doctor, the doctor might need to talk to patients. You could look at the language of doctor-patient discourse and teach the doctor to work within that type of conversation. However, the real change that happened in the 80s was the product of research into second language acquisition. People became interested now in how people learnt languages and why some language learners were more effective than others. Was it their age? Was it their motivation? Was it natural aptitude? What was it exactly that made one person able to learn a language faster or more successfully than the next? Second language acquisition research also investigated the idea of learning and acquisition, positing that in fact there were two processes going on. One, formal learning, conscious learning, what we normally expect to happen in the classroom, and the other, acquisition, the natural way of learning a language as a child learns their first language. And for many years, debate raged about whether these were two separate processes, whether they could affect each other, whether one was more effective than the other, and so on and so forth. This idea of acquisition as a process led to criticisms of language teaching methodology, and in particular the strict presentation, practice, production idea. The idea that the teacher could take a bit of the language when he or she wanted to. Today we're going to do the present perfect. And present it to the learner, and the learner would assimilate that language there and then. People started suggesting that it didn't happen like that. There were language learning processes going on that we had to work with. We couldn't work against. We couldn't decide today we're going to learn the present perfect. That would happen when and if the learner was ready for it. And so all we could do in the classroom was create the conditions for language acquisition, for the learner to learn to assimilate the structures, the lexis or whatever, when he or she was ready. And this led to the idea of the processed syllabus, which developed into what we now know as task-based learning, which we'll be looking at in some detail. There was a lot going on at the time, and it was all going on simultaneously. Of necessity, we're going to have to look at one thing at a time, but don't lose sight of the idea that it wasn't happening one thing after the other. It was all happening at the same time, and different ideas were affecting different teachers and so on and so forth in different areas of the world. What was happening in Europe was not the same as what was happening in the States, and so on. Another big influence that was happening at the time was the influence of the humanist psychologists such as Maslow and Rogers, and that led to the movement which has become known as humanism in language teaching, which in some cases developed into specific methodologies like community language learning, and in others simply had an effect on our overall approach to language teaching. For example, our view of teacher and student roles. In addition, it gave a big push to the move towards creating learner autonomy, the idea that we can empower learners by teaching them not simply the language, but also how to learn the language and developing that autonomous ability. And finally, there was the work of the educational psychologists, people such as Brunner, Vygotsky, and so on. Their influence, I think, didn't have quite such an impact until fairly recently, and that really just about brings us up to date. The only thing that I've not mentioned there, which obviously has had a big effect on language teaching in the last 20 or 30 years, is what's known as the lexical approach, but that we'll be dealing with in a later unit. So those are the areas that we're going to be looking at in this unit. We're going to be looking first of all at needs analysis and the ESP movement, but then we're going to turn our attention to the psychological factors, second language acquisition, research and so on, that have influenced language teaching in the last 30 years or so.